Hi guys, I'm Peter.
My name's Tanner.
And this is the Decryption Podcast.
Considering all the evidence that has now been presented, you should now be able to connect the dots that explosives were used to demolish the Twin Towers and Building 7. To put the final nail in the coffin, what if we told you they tested dust from the debris and found actual evidence of thermite? And like all the other witness accounts, this evidence was ignored as well, even though it is a scientific fact.
When thermite is detonated, it leaves traces of itself within the debris. Those traces are known as perfectly round pieces of iron.
It will also leave bits of unexploded thermite itself. Scientists found traces of both the microscopic spheres and bits of unexploded thermite in the dust recorded from ground zero. They also found red-gray chips, which when they were later tested, they also proved that they were from the thermite.
Not only did they continuously find thermite, but there was also traces of nanothermite found, which is a lot more lethal than regular thermite. You know, there's really only one big problem that comes with nanothermite, and it's that they're made in labs. And not just any labs, because nanothermite is only produced in very sophisticated U.S. Defensive Department contracted laboratories. Yes, you heard that right. I said sophisticated U.S. Defense Department contracted laboratories. Like, I had to say it twice so you guys can understand how sophisticated this shit really is. This is not something that you can just make in a cave in Afghanistan or in a freaking bombed out building. And not to mention that nanothermite is a military grade weapon.
In 3 different samples from 3 independent researchers, the R.J. Lee Company, the USGS, and Dr. Stephen Jones's work. All 3 separately found these microspheres.
As much as 6% of the World Trade Center dust consisted of tiny, previously molten iron spheres.
You cannot get a perfectly round sphere of metal from the building tearing apart. The only way you can get that is by starting with a molten liquid. Then the hydrostatic pressure will create the perfectly round sphere as it solidifies.
So what produced all that molten iron? Well, it has in it the chemical evidence of a special incendiary, which is thermite, a high-tech incendiary used to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. These spheres have iron, aluminum, fluorine, manganese, very unusual elements associated only with thermite. And there's small chips of unignited thermite as well.
In the dust, we found what we characterize as unreacted thermitic material, and in the shape of some very tiny red-gray chips.
We captured the residue after the material had been heated. The red-gray chips, as we ignite them, produce spheres that have iron and aluminum, just like we see in the dust in abundance.
And the composition was very, very similar. And that led to the conclusion of the paper, which was, we've got some form of thermite in these red-gray chips.
What I can confirm also is that these chips, the red layer is thermitic. It does produce molten iron.
I've heard this argument that somehow perhaps someone seeded these samples with nanothermite.
There have been some that have argued that these red-gray chips could be paint of some form.
I've also heard the argument that perhaps the falling buildings just generated this nanothermite. Well, no.
So it wasn't, the red-gray chips are not the primer paint that was used on the WTC steel.
These chips are not naturally occurring. They are not going to form because some materials fall down in a building and touch each other and get compressed together. That's just not what this material is.
What we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite, which is produced in a different way. It is not just 2 powders being mixed.
First of all, the iron oxide grains are uniform and approximately 100 nanometers across. That's very tiny, much smaller than a human hair. The aluminum occurs in plates that are about 40 nanometers across. I have no idea how to make those. I mean, this is a high-tech material, and it's embedded in a carbon-rich matrix with order. These red-gray materials have very orderly sheets containing aluminum.
This is a material that is made up of nano-sized particles that are all very uniform, very symmetrical.
The aluminum appears in thin platelets about 40 nanometers thick. It is the small size of the particles involved in this material that allow us to characterize it as nanothermite.
These really are sophisticated materials and probably only developed in a laboratory.
This is very high-tech thermite, nanothermite. It's not found in a cave in Afghanistan. It's produced in very sophisticated Defense Department contracting laboratories.
We compared our spike that we got with a spike from known nanothermite, which is produced at a military laboratory. Their measured energy released with known nanothermite was less than these red-gray chips.
What we are dealing with, I think, in World Trade Center is modern military material which is unknown to the general public.
It takes steel and it creates molten steel. So it takes beams of steel and it turns it into molten steel, and it just everything underneath just sinks into the ground like what you saw. And it is a special U.S. military grade weapon.
So the military uses it for a number of different applications.
Okay? It is a military grade weapon. It's not something you could make ever.
There's now a lot of questions we should be asking. Why were we able to see squibs as the building was falling? Why did so many people hear explosions and even claim to see explosions, but it was never documented in the official reports? And how do you explain the molten steel? The temperatures of the fire were nearly 1,000 degrees less than what's needed to melt metal.
And why were so many tons of metal able to melt? How do you explain the rate that it fell at? How do you explain Building 7 collapsing later into the day at 5:20?
And why were we taught so much about 9/11 in school, but never once did we discuss Building 7? And how do you explain them finding thermite in the dust? And why were they able to find out that not only was it thermite, but it was nanothermite?
How do you explain a military-grade weapon made in government-affiliated labs being produced in a cave in a third-world country by a guy that's on the run? And then, how would they be able to bring all of that nanothermite into America and sneak it into the Twin Towers and then also rig every level of the building? On top of that, how are they able to get past the security desks every day if they were to have done that?
And how are they able to get access to the elevator shafts? Where was the security during the months-long process it would need to take? And how are they able to get into the basement? Remember, this is the World Trade Center. A lot of doorways and floor levels were restricted access. They would be facing an incredible risk every single day. So how are they able to be so confident they could pull it off without being detected just once?
Why would the terrorists put their whole plans at risk by using box cutters to overthrow military and combat trained pilots? And if they knew the building was going to blow up, then why would they have multiple pilots go and commit suicide when the whole building was going to come down anyways? And why would they do all of this knowing that they can still be tracked by our central intelligence agencies?
So that's a lot of questions, but here's what we do know. We do know this building was brought down via controlled demolition, allegedly. We also know that military-grade thermite, including nanothermite, was used.
We also know that NIST, the National Institute of Standards of Technology, was used to cover this whole thing up. And then we also know that we were supposed to believe that airplanes caused all of this. Not a lot of people know this, but 9 months before 9/11, the elevators were actually going through a modernization.
This modernization would give a certain group of people a reason to be there, they could get past security, access to restricted areas because they would get special keys or entry cards, and they'd have a reason to be working uninterrupted for 9 months.
The elevators were also locked at all times, and if that wasn't enough, they even had security guards being there the whole time. How convenient.
Video cameras caught trucks arriving at the World Trade Center every night from August 23rd to September 2nd. These trucks would arrive at 3 in the morning after everyone had left the building, including the janitors. During that 10-day period, they brought in a lot of undisclosed materials uninterrupted.
Anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
The columns could have been set up with explosive devices during the off-hour operations of the building by elevator company personnel.
It wouldn't be a problem once you gained access to the elevator shafts.
How about an elevator modernization, which we know was going on the 9 months prior to 9/11? There are people who noted that the elevators were locked in turn and that there were guards placed at these locked elevators during the modernization.
And in the case of a steel frame building, that means we load them with RDX cutting charges, which are loaded with individual delays, sometimes as many as 2 to 3 different delays on a given floor.
I was sick to death of the dust which was appearing on the windowsills. It was dirty grey and very, very noticeable in that week leading up to 9/11.
There were workers throughout the World Trade Center and it had access to the hoistway, which is immediately adjacent to the core columns and beams in the building.
The fact that there were visitors, like engineers of some kind, wandering around the floors, carrying toolboxes and cables and so on.
We're talking about several tons of nanothermite and ordinary thermite. One would have to have access through security.
Video cameras caught trucks arriving at the World Trade Center from about August 23rd until every night until about September 2nd, September 3rd. And the trucks were arriving at about 3 o'clock in the morning when everybody else had left the building, including the janitorial trucks. Something was brought into that building that would help with the detonation. There may have been work done on the detonation before. It may have been going on for months, but whatever they needed at the very end, they came and brought in that 10-day period.
And now, let's talk about the security company. So, I'm not sure if many people know this, but Marvin Bush, who is the brother of George Bush, and again, that was the president at the time, and their cousin, Wirt Walker, were principals for the company that was in charge of security for 9/11 and the Trade Towers.
This security company was called Stratesec Incorporated. Their slogan read, "Securing the planet from global chaos." I think it's safe to say they failed. This company also used to be called Securicom Incorporated.
However, they weren't only contracted to be security for the World Trade Center. They had contracts with other places such as Dulles International Airport, where Flight 93 departed, and United Airlines, which accounted for most of the security breakdowns prior to 9/11.
Stratesec also handled security for Los Alamos National Labs. What is Los Alamos National Labs? Well, that's a laboratory that works under the United States Department of Energy. Los Alamos National Labs are also one of the only labs in the world capable of producing nanothermite.
The 9/11 Commission also does not tell you that Marvin Bush, the president's brother, and their cousin, Wirt Walker, were the principals of the company that was in charge of security for the World Trade Center. They don't,
The jaw-dropping coincidences kept piling up. I learned that Stratesec was a security company which used to be called Securicom, and they didn't just handle security for the World Trade Center complex. They had contracts with Dulles International Airport, from where Flight 93 departed, and United Airlines, accounting for most of the security breakdowns on 9/11. And another thing, Stratesec also handles security for Los Alamos National Labs, one of the only places on the planet that can produce the nanothermite found in the ground zero dust.
How does one security company have so many significant links to the events of 9/11? Something else that doesn't make sense is that in the official 567-page report about 9/11 that was released, neither Stratesec or Securicom were mentioned even once.
So you're telling me, out of the entire report, 567 pages long, never once did they address the security of the Twin Towers, and never once did they address the security of the airports, or how the security for the towers and the airlines were the same company? Did you also know that in the same 567-page official report, never once did they mention the collapse of Building 7?
The odds are pretty astonishing that one company can link so many vital elements of 9/11. But more astonishing is there's no mention of Stratesec or Securicom in the entire 567-page 9/11 Commission report. Of course, that was no surprise by now. Did I forget to mention that that same 9/11 Commission did not mention the collapse of Building 7 in the entire report either?
But are you even surprised at this point? How do you come out with a final report that's nearly 600 pages long, but never mention one of the 3 buildings that literally fell? Not even once that it isn't just mind-boggling. Clearly, they don't want you to know about Building 7, or any of the security parties that were involved. When asked about why they didn't put the collapse of Building 7 in the report, Thomas Keane, a chairman of the 9/11 Commission, said, quote, "We didn't see any evidence of this thing that you were talking about." Watch this.
Why is there not a word about the collapse of that building in the 9/11 Commission report?
We didn't see any evidence of the kind of thing you're talking about.
So I'm not going to bombard you with questions like I did a few minutes ago, but I have one final question for you guys to think about before we leave for this video. And that is, do you still think this attack was done by terrorists?
Alright guys, so I hope you were able to digest everything we put on your plate, but this is it for right now. I'm Peter.
My name's Tanner.
And this has been the Decryption Podcast. Peace and love.